Before we start, leave a comment telling us which city in Canada you're watching from. And at the end, don't forget to rate this story from 0 to 10. I'll give you my entire month's salary if you can tell me what this says. Dr. Callum Hurst didn't look up from the papers in his hand when he said it. He was standing at the head of the conference table on the 4th floor of Westmount General Hospital in Montreal, and he was not in a good mood. The papers had arrived that morning by courier from Tokyo, dense, formal, written entirely in Japanese. The patient attached to those documents was Kenji Watanabe, 73 years old, billionaire founder of a pharmaceutical group that operated in 11 countries. He'd collapsed during a layover at Trudeau Airport, been rushed to Westmount General, and now required emergency cardiac surgery within the next 6 hours. The documents contained his full medical history, prior procedures, allergies, current medications, information the surgical team needed before they could safely put him under. The problem was that not a single person in that room could read a word of it. 4 senior physicians, 2 surgical residents, a hospital administrator named Gordon Fitch who kept adjusting his glasses and saying nothing useful. Callum had already called the hospital's language services coordinator, who apologized and said their Japanese interpreter was in Vancouver at a conference, and the backup was. And this was the part that made Callum's jaw tighten. On parental leave. I'll give you my entire month's salary if you can tell me what this says. Callum repeated, louder this time, half joke, half genuine desperation, tossing the document onto the table where it fanned out among coffee cups and surgical schedules. 1 month, $45,000. Someone. Anyone. Nervous laughter from the residents. Dr. Patricia Howe, the anesthesiologist, covered her mouth with a pen cap. Gordon Fitch stopped adjusting his glasses. The voice that answered came from near the door. I can read it. The room went quiet in that particular way that happens when something unexpected enters the air. Standing just inside the doorway was a woman in the pale green uniform of the hospital's environmental services department. She was holding a mop with one hand and a bucket handle with the other, and she had clearly been about to continue past the open door when the words stopped her. Her hair was pulled back. There was a small bleach stain on her left sleeve. She looked to be in her early 30s, though something in her eyes suggested she had lived more than her age implied. She said it again calmly. I can read Japanese. Those documents. If you'd like, I can translate them for you. Someone at the table laughed. Not meanly, exactly. But in that dismissive way people laugh when something doesn't fit the shape of their expectations. Dr. Patricia Howe blinked. Sweetheart, this is a medical document. Technical terminology. Surgical history. I understand. The woman didn't move from the doorway. I can still read it. Callum looked at her for a long moment. He was not a man who softened easily. He had spent 15 years building a reputation as one of the finest cardiac surgeons in the country, and he had done it in large part by being very precise about who he trusted with what. He did not, as a rule, trust people who showed up holding mops. But Kenji Watanabe was in a bed upstairs, with a deteriorating aortic valve and 6 hours on the clock. Come in, Callum said. She set the mop against the wall outside and walked to the table. Someone slid the papers toward her. She sat down. No one had offered her a chair, but she took one anyway, which Callum noted, and she began to read. The room was silent except for the hum of the ventilation system and the distant sound of a monitor somewhere down the hall. She read for perhaps 90 seconds. Then she looked up. His name is written here as Watanabe Kenji, which is the Japanese order. Family name first. He had a mitral valve repair in Osaka in 2019. There's a note here from his cardiologist that he reacted poorly to propofol during that procedure. He came out of sedation confused and agitated. Took nearly 4 hours to stabilize. His current medications include, she listed 6, pronouncing each one correctly, including the dosages and the schedule. And there is a standing instruction here from his primary physician in Tokyo that he is not to receive blood thinners within 48 hours of surgery without consultation. It's flagged twice. Someone thought it was important. Silence. Dr. Patricia Howe had stopped smiling. Callum stared at the woman across the table. The propofol reaction, what exactly does the document say about it? She looked back at the page. His cardiologist describes it as a prolonged emergence agitation, possibly linked to a sensitivity. He recommends an alternative induction agent and notes that Watanabe himself had requested this be flagged for any future procedures abroad. She paused. He wrote it in the margin, actually, in a slightly different pen. I think he added it later, after the fact, as a reminder. Callum sat back in his throat. Well, that's useful. Callum ignored him. He was still looking at the woman. Can you stay? I need a full written translation of everything in those documents before we go into surgery. I need it in 2 hours. I have a full floor to clean before my shift ends. I'll arrange coverage. She held his gaze. And the salary you mentioned? The room shifted. Someone inhaled. Callum realized, with a strange sensation he couldn't quite name, that she had not forgotten he'd said it. That was a figure of speech, he said carefully. You said it twice, she replied. The second time, you said someone, anyone, I answered. He studied her. She did not look away. What's your name? He asked. Vivienne, Audette Vivienne. He said it like he was testing the weight of it. Prepare the translation. We'll discuss compensation afterward. She nodded once, pulled the documents toward her, and asked someone quietly if she could use a laptop. Callum left the room. In the hallway, Patricia Howe caught up to him. Callum, who is that woman? I have no idea, he said, and he meant it in more ways than one. The translation Vivienne Audet produced in the next 90 minutes was, according to the hospital's external review later that week, more thorough and more medically precise than any they had received through their official language services. She had not only translated the documents but had organized the information chronologically, flagged the propofol note in red with a recommended alternative based on the prior cardiologist's suggestion, and included a brief notation at the bottom. Note, patient's Tokyo physician can be reached at this number if surgical team requires clarification on the blood thinner protocol. Time zone difference is 14 hours. Kenji Watanabe went into surgery at 4 in the afternoon and came out of it successfully at 7:30. The anesthesiologist used ketamine for induction. The patient stabilized without incident. Callum found Vivienne in the basement corridor at 8:15, returning her mop and bucket to the supply room. The surgery went well, he said. I know, I heard. She didn't ask how he'd found her. I owe you a conversation about compensation. You owe me $45,000, she said, without heat, without drama. Just the fact of it. That's what you said. It was, he began. A joke, she finished. You've said that. But I took it seriously, and so I came into that room when everyone else was looking at each other and saying nothing. She turned to look at him for the first time since he'd come downstairs. That's the difference between us right now. Callum had not, in a very long time, been made to feel that he was the one on the wrong side of a conversation. He opened his mouth. He closed it. Come to my office tomorrow morning, he said at last, 8 o'clock. She looked at him steadily. My shift starts at 7. I'll arrange it. She nodded and went back to organizing the supply shelves. He stood in the doorway for another moment, and then he left. He didn't sleep well that night. In the morning, Vivienne Audet sat in the chair across from his desk and looked around the office with the calm, thorough attention of someone who notices everything. His degrees on the wall. The photo of the Ottawa skyline, the lack of any personal photographs. Callum noticed her noticing. I want to offer you a formal role, he said. Medical interpreter on contract. We work with patients from Japan, Korea, China, Vietnam. The city is international and our language services are inadequate. You'd be called in when needed, paid per engagement. He named a number. She considered it. What languages do you think I speak? She asked. He paused. Japanese, obviously. Also French, both Quebec and continental. Mandarin, Korean, and enough medical Vietnamese to get through a consultation without causing a misunderstanding. She said it the same way she'd said everything, not to impress, just to inform. I want a retainer, not per engagement. $3,000 a month guaranteed, plus $200 per hour when called in. And I keep my current position. He raised an eyebrow. You want to keep cleaning floors? I want to keep my benefits, she said. My son is in occupational therapy 3 times a week. I need the health coverage. There it was. He had wondered. How old is he? She looked at him. Why? I'm asking, as if she were deciding whether the question was worth answering. 8. His name is Theo. He has sensory processing disorder. Not severe, but he needs consistent support. A pause. His father decided, when Theo was 2, that consistent support was more than he wanted to provide. So it's just us. Callum said nothing for a moment. Outside his window, the city was already gray and moving. I'll have contracts drawn up, he said. Retainer, plus hourly. Benefits remain through your current position as long as you want them. And the 45,000? He looked at her. You saved a man's life yesterday, she said quietly. I helped you do it, and you made a promise in front of a room full of witnesses. He picked up his pen. He wrote a number on a piece of paper and slid it across the desk. It was not the full amount. It was 20,000. She looked at it. Then she looked at him. I'll see you when you have the contracts ready, she said, and stood up. He realized, as she walked out of his office, that she had not taken the paper. He had expected her to negotiate down. Instead, she had walked away from $20,000 rather than accept less than what she'd been promised. He sat with that for a long time after she left. 3 days later, he called her in for a Korean patient, a grandmother who had arrived from Busan with her daughter, and could not explain where the pain was because no one on the ward spoke Korean, and the daughter's English was limited to please, and thank you and my mother is hurting. Vivienne spent 40 minutes with them. When she came out of the room, the grandmother's chart had been updated, the pain management plan had been revised, and the daughter was crying quietly with relief. She was describing a pain in her lower left side, Vivienne told Callum in the hallway. She kept saying the word for kidney, but she was pointing to her hip. I think there's been a language error in her intake form. Someone assumed kidney when she meant the joint. You might want to look at that. He ordered an X-ray. It showed early-stage hip deterioration that had been completely missed. That evening, he found himself walking past the 4th-floor corridor 20 minutes after his last surgery, which was not on his way to anywhere in particular. Vivienne was mopping the hallway near the east stairwell, earbuds in, moving with the efficient rhythm of someone who has done a thing so many times it has become meditative. She didn't see him. He kept walking, but he came back the next day with 2 coffees from the place on Sherbrooke that everyone on staff ordered from when they wanted something decent. I don't drink hospital coffee, she said without turning around. It's not from the hospital. I don't drink coffee from people who owe me money either. He stood holding both cups. She kept working. He set one on the cart beside her, took his own, and left. The next week, he found the cups still there, untouched. The week after that, when he came back, he told himself it was to discuss a Vietnamese patient, which was also true. The cup was gone. She didn't mention it, neither did he. Callum was not by nature a person who wondered about other people. He was precise, efficient, focused. He had been engaged once, briefly, to a woman named Renata who had eventually told him, not unkindly, that being with him felt like being adjacent to someone rather than with them. He had thought about that for years afterward, not with grief exactly, but with a kind of puzzled interest, like a problem he kept returning to without making progress on. Vivienne Odette was the first person in a long time who made him feel like he was actually in the room. He had Mariana, his administrative coordinator, look into her background, quietly, through the hospital's HR system. What Mariana found made him sit down. Vivienne Odette had graduated from the University of Toronto with a degree in East Asian languages and cultures, first in her class, followed by a master's in medical interpretation from McGill. She had worked for 3 years at Global Health Alliance, a Vancouver-based NGO that placed interpreters in international hospitals and refugee health clinics across Southeast Asia and East Africa. And then, 5 years ago, her employment history simply stopped. No registered employer, no professional listings. And then, 4 years ago, her name appeared in Westmount General's HR system as a member of the environmental services team. He called Mariana back. What happened in between? There's a gap of about a year, Mariana said. I can't find anything in that window. Something had broken, somewhere in that year. He didn't know what. But he knew, with the quiet certainty of a surgeon who has learned to trust what the imaging doesn't show, that whatever it was had been significant. He tried asking her directly. A few days later, when they were walking out of a consultation with a Mandarin-speaking family, whose teenage son had just been diagnosed with a cardiac arrhythmia, she had handled the entire conversation, the diagnosis, the fear, the questions, with a steadiness that moved him in a way he didn't quite have language for yet. Can I ask you something? He said in the hallway after the family had gone. You can ask. Why did you stop? After Global Health Alliance. What happened? She was quiet for a moment, not evasive, thinking. I found out, she said carefully, that the organization I worked for was not doing what it said it was doing. He waited. Global Health Alliance was placing interpreters in clinics across Southeast Asia. That part was true. What they didn't advertise was that some of those clinics were being used as cover for pharmaceutical companies that were running unapproved drug trials on patients who didn't understand what they were consenting to. She said it evenly, the way people say things they have had to say many times in their heads before they could say them out loud. I found out because I was translating the consent forms, and I understood what they actually said versus what the patients were being told. Callum stopped walking. I reported it internally. My supervisor told me I had misunderstood the documents. I reported it to the board. The board told me the same thing. I gathered evidence, consent forms, internal communications, correspondence between GHA and the pharmaceutical company, and I brought it to Health Canada. She paused. They opened an investigation, and 2 weeks later I was terminated for professional misconduct. GHA told everyone in the field that I had fabricated the allegations out of personal grievance. That's illegal, he said. Yes, I hired a lawyer. My savings ran out in 8 months. The case was settled out of court with a non-disclosure agreement that I signed because I had a 6-month-old and no income, and I had already spent everything I had. She looked at him. I signed it. I know what that means. I know people will say I should have held out. But Theo needed formula, and I needed to sleep, and I was alone, and she stopped, drew a breath. I signed it. He said nothing for a moment. The hallway was empty. A cart rolled past at the far end. And after that, he said quietly, you couldn't get work. GHA had contacts everywhere. My references were poisoned before I knew it was happening. Environmental Services doesn't ask about your professional history. She almost smiled, but not quite. They ask if you can start Monday. Callum stood with this information the way he stood with a difficult imaging result. Looking at it from every angle, understanding what it meant, understanding also that there was nothing about it that was fair. Vivienne. He said her name differently than he had the first time. Don't, she said. I haven't said anything yet. You were going to say you want to help. I was going to say I'm sorry. She looked at him. He meant it. She could tell. Thank you, she said. And then, I have to finish the East Wing before 3. She walked away. He stayed where he was for a moment, in the particular stillness of someone who has just understood something important. The following Monday, Callum arrived at work to find 3 messages waiting for him. 2 were from colleagues. The third was from the hospital's chief of operations, a man named Raymond Pratt, asking for an urgent meeting. In that meeting, Raymond was joined by Dr. Susan Bellamy, head of the Medical Staff Association, and a senior HR representative named Patrick, who kept a folder on his lap and did not open it. Callum, Raymond began. We need to discuss the audit situation. What situation? The contract you've given her. The translation work. He searched for the word, visibility. She's a qualified interpreter who is saving the hospital money and improving patient outcomes, Callum said. What's the situation? Susan leaned forward. There are concerns. She's a member of the Environmental Services staff. She's now being invited into sensitive clinical consultations, given access to confidential patient information, which interpreters always have. That's the job. She doesn't have the institutional credentials. She has a master's degree in medical interpretation from McGill. She speaks 5 languages. She caught a diagnostic error last week that could have turned into a lawsuit. What credential is she missing? Raymond and Susan exchanged a look that Callum recognized. It was the look people exchanged when the real reason wasn't the one they'd said. There's also the question, Patrick said quietly, of your personal interest in her. Callum looked at him. The coffees, Raymond said. The conversations in the corridor. People talk, Callum. It looks like what, exactly? It looks like something that could create a liability for the hospital. If the relationship were to, there is no relationship. He said it flatly. And it was true, technically. There's a professional arrangement between a physician and an interpreter, which is a normal and documented hospital practice. He looked around the table. If any of you can show me a policy that prohibits what I've done, I'll listen. Otherwise, this meeting is finished. He stood up. Callum, Raymond's voice was careful. We're asking you to consider whether your judgment on this particular matter might be compromised. A pause. Let me be precise, Callum said. Vivienne Audet is the most effective interpreter this hospital has worked with in the decade I've been here. She identified a medication interaction that I would not have caught without those documents. She has improved care for patients who had no other way of communicating their needs. If the objection is that she mops floors between engagements, then the objection is about status, not about medicine. And I won't act on it. He left. He told himself, walking back to his office, that he was being rational, professional, principled. He did not tell himself that the thought of Vivienne Audette being quietly edged out of the hospital made him feel something that had nothing to do with professional principle. That evening he found her in the east stairwell, sitting on the second-to-last step, eating a sandwich from a paper bag. It was the kind of thing that happened in hospitals. People eating in stairwells because there was nowhere else quiet enough. He sat down on the step beside her without asking. She looked at him. "There was a meeting about you today," he said. "I assumed there would be eventually. They want me to step back from the arrangement. Are you going to?" He looked at the middle distance. No. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Why not?" "Because it's the right call medically, and because," he stopped, "because," he turned to look at her. She was watching him with that steady, clear attention of hers, the kind that made him feel visible in a way he wasn't accustomed to. "Because you came into that room when no one else did," he said. "And I think that should mean something." She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she looked away. "Callum," she said. His name, just his name, in that quiet voice of hers. "Yes, don't mistake being impressed by someone for something else." He almost said he knew the difference. But he sat with it instead, and he wasn't entirely sure he did. She finished her sandwich. She stood up and folded the paper bag with the tidy economy she applied to everything. "Thank you," she said, "for the meeting, for what you probably said in it." She went back up the stairs. He sat on the step for a while after she was gone. 3 weeks later, 2 things happened on the same Tuesday. The first. Callum's phone rang at 7 in the morning. Unknown number identified herself as Agente Commissaire Hélène Tremblay of the RCMP's Financial Crimes and Healthcare Fraud Division. She said she was calling about an ongoing investigation into Global Health Alliance and its affiliated pharmaceutical partners. She said they had been building a case for 4 years. She said Vivienne Audette's name had come up as the original source of the initial complaint to Health Canada. "We need to speak with her," Agente Commissaire Tremblay said. "She's been formally subpoenaed to testify before a federal review panel. The hearing is in Ottawa. Next Thursday." Callum sat down on the edge of his desk. She signed an NDA. "Non-disclosure agreements do not apply in federal investigations," Tremblay said. "And we've recovered documentation she may not know we have. We found a file that was submitted to Health Canada's digital archive in 2020. It was flagged as incomplete and never acted on, but it was preserved. It contains the original consent forms she copied before her termination." Callum was quiet for a moment. "Does she know about this call?" "We're attempting to reach her now, but she doesn't appear to have a listed number." He gave them her work contact, which was in the hospital system. The second thing that happened, Theo's school called Vivienne at 9:15 to say he'd had a difficult morning and could she please come. She was in the middle of the 3rd-floor east corridor when she got the call. She stood with the mop handle in one hand and her phone in the other, and she thought, for a moment, that the floor beneath her felt less solid than it usually did. Callum found her 40 minutes later in the lobby, coat on, waiting for a cab. "Theo," he said. He had heard through the nursing station, hospitals were permeable things, and people noticed when Vivienne moved differently. He had a hard morning. His TA was sick, they put someone new in, he doesn't do well with sudden change. She said it quickly, the way parents summarize to people who are not parents. "I just need to go get him, I'll drive you." She looked at him. "You have surgery at 11, it's 9:20, I'll drive you." She studied him for a moment, then nodded once. "Okay." Theo's school was in NDG, 20 minutes away. Vivienne sat in the passenger seat and looked out the window and didn't say anything, which Callum found he didn't mind. He was not a person who needed conversation to fill silence. The school was a low brick building with a mural of the St. Lawrence on the outer wall. Vivienne was out of the car before he'd fully stopped. He parked and waited. She came out 10 minutes later with a small boy at her side. He was wearing a red coat that was slightly too big for him, and he was walking with deliberate concentration, counting something under his breath. He had Vivienne's eyes exactly, that same quality of steady attention, the kind that seemed to take in everything. Vivienne said something to him quietly. He looked up at the car, then at Callum, with the frank, unself-conscious assessment of a child who hasn't yet learned to pretend he isn't looking. "Hi," the boy said. "Hi," Callum said. "I'm Callum. I work with your mum." Theo considered this. "Are you a doctor?" "I am. Mum says doctors are the loudest people in the hospital." He said it without malice, the way children state observations. Vivienne pressed her lips together. "She's not wrong," Callum said. Theo got in the back seat. He asked if Callum had any gum, and Callum found a piece in the center console from approximately 6 months ago, and Theo accepted it with the gravity of someone receiving a meaningful gift. Vivienne did not say anything about the ancient gum. She just looked out the window with her knuckle resting against her mouth, and Callum could see in her profile the particular exhaustion of a person who has been doing everything alone for a long time. He drove them home. The apartment was in Côte des Neiges, a third-floor walk-up on a street lined with mature maples. Vivienne thanked him at the door. Theo said goodbye to his shoes. Callum drove back to the hospital thinking about the RCMP call, thinking about the file in Ottawa's digital archive, thinking about a woman who had done the right thing and spent 4 years mopping floors because of it. He called Agente Commissaire Tremblay back from the parking garage and asked if there was anything the hospital could do to formally support Vivienne's testimony. There was a pause. Then, Tremblay said that a statement of professional character from a physician of standing would not be unwelcome. He wrote it that afternoon. He wrote it honestly, what he had observed, what she had done, what kind of person she was. He did not write it because it would help the case, though it would. He wrote it because it was true and because he was tired of true things going undocumented. Vivienne found out about the RCMP call that evening, when an officer came to her apartment door. She called Callum at 9:30. He answered on the second ring. "You knew this morning," she said. "Yes, you didn't tell me. You were going to get Theo. I didn't think it was the right moment." A silence. What did they say? "They have the Aboriginal documents. The consent forms. They've been building the case for 4 years. He paused. "You did something that mattered, Vivienne, and even when it felt like it disappeared, it didn't. It was in an archive somewhere, waiting." She didn't speak for a moment. He could hear the quiet of her apartment, and underneath it, very faintly, the sound of a child's television program. "I'm frightened," she said, quietly, like a fact. "I know the NDA doesn't apply to federal testimony. The officer would have told you." She did. A breath. "GHA has very good lawyers. So does the RCMP." Another silence. Then, "Callum, yes. Why did you write a character statement without telling me?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because you shouldn't have to ask for that. You shouldn't have had to ask for any of this." She didn't respond immediately. When she did, her voice was careful. "You should know that I'm not easy to be close to. I don't accept things easily. I'm not going to suddenly become someone who lets people in just because they were kind to me once." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to." "Then what are you asking?" He thought about it honestly. "I'm not sure yet, but I don't think that has to be decided tonight." A long pause. "Theo asked about you," she said at last, "when I put him to bed. He asked if you were my friend." "What did you say?" "I said I wasn't sure yet." He almost smiled. "That's fair. Good night, Callum." "Good night." He sat in his car in the hospital parking garage for another 15 minutes, in the dark and the quiet, and felt something unfamiliar and not entirely unwelcome settling somewhere in his chest. The Federal Review Panel hearing took place on a Thursday in a government building in Ottawa, with tall windows and bad overhead lighting. Vivienne wore the one blazer she owned, charcoal gray over a white shirt. She had taken the 7 o'clock train from Montreal. She had left Theo with her neighbor Claudette, who was 71 and made him crepes and let him watch too much television, both of which Vivienne considered acceptable trade-offs for difficult mornings. The hearing room was smaller than she had expected. There were 6 panel members. There were lawyers, GHAs, flanked by 2 others she didn't recognize. There was a court reporter. There were cameras because the panel had voted to allow a media pool. Vivienne sat in the witness chair and put her hands flat on the table and breathed. The federal counsel, a composed woman named Maître Fournier, began, "Ms. Audette, in 2019, were you employed as a medical interpreter with Global Health Alliance?" "Yes." "And in that capacity, did you translate consent documents for patients in GHA-affiliated clinics in Thailand and Cambodia?" "Yes." "And what did you find?" Vivienne looked at the panel. She thought about the signing of the NDA, which she had done at a table very much like this one. with Theo asleep in a carrier on her chest because she couldn't afford a sitter. She thought about the year of silence that had followed, the job applications that went nowhere, the way people stopped returning her calls once GHA's version of events had made the rounds. She thought about sitting in a hospital stairwell, eating a sandwich, and a man she didn't expect sitting down beside her. I found that patients were being enrolled in drug trials without informed consent, she said. The consent forms were written in formal legal Thai and Khmer, dialects that many of the rural patients could not read. The interpreters provided by the pharmaceutical company were summarizing the forms, not translating them. The patients believed they were consenting to free medical treatment. They were not told they were in a trial. They were not told the medications were unapproved. They were not told there were risks. And what did you do with this information? I copied the original consent forms. I documented what patients had told me they understood versus what the forms actually said. I reported it internally on 3 separate occasions. I reported it to the board. And then I submitted a formal complaint to Health Canada with the documentation attached. And then I was terminated 11 days later. Slowly. Mrs. Audit, I'm going to show you a document. She placed something on the table in front of Vivienne. Can you tell the panel what this is? Vivienne looked at it, her throat tightened. It was one of the consent forms. The original, the one she had copied at 3 in the morning in a clinic in Chiang Rai, her hands shaking, because she had understood even then that she was crossing a line she couldn't uncross. This is a consent form, she said. From a patient I'll call patient 7. She was 56 years old. She had come to the clinic for treatment for a respiratory infection. This form enrolled her in a phase 2 trial for a cardiac medication. Vivienne kept her voice steady. She was not a cardiac patient. She had no cardiac history. She was enrolled because GHA was behind on trial numbers and needed warm bodies. A murmur went through the room. The GHA lawyers consulted quietly. What did patient 7 believe she was signing? Maître Fournier asked. She believed she was signing a form that said she had received antibiotics and understood the dosage instructions. Vivienne looked at the panel. I know because I asked her. I sat with her for 20 minutes afterward, and I asked her what she thought she had agreed to. She told me, and what she told me had nothing to do with what she had signed. The hearing went on for 3 more hours. By the time Vivienne stepped out of the building into the cold October air, the media pool had questions, and she said no comment with the practiced ease of someone who had rehearsed it on the train. Her phone had 17 missed calls, most from numbers she didn't recognize. There was one from Claudette saying Theo had eaten 2 crepes and fallen asleep watching his nature documentary. There was one from Callum. She called him back, walking across the plaza. How did it go? He said it went. She pulled her coat tighter. The sky over Ottawa was low and white. They have everything. The forms, the internal communications, the pharmaceutical company's correspondence with GHA's board. Maître Fournier showed me a transcript of a meeting where 2 GHA executives discussed me by name and agreed that I needed to be. She paused. The word they used was neutralized. Callum was quiet for a moment. Vivienne, I know. Are you all right? She stood on the plaza, in front of a government building in a city that was not hers, and she thought about the word neutralized and about the years she had spent not quite believing she wasn't crazy. About Theo learning to walk while she was simultaneously learning to disappear into employment that no one looked at. I will be, she said. I'm going to get the train back and pick up my son. There's something I need to tell you, Callum said. What? I spoke to Raymond Pratt this morning, and to Susan Bellamy and to the board's legal counsel. A pause. I told them that if the hospital was not prepared to formally support your role as a clinical interpreter, with full institutional credentials and appropriate compensation, I would be tendering my resignation. She stopped walking. You did what? I've been here 12 years. I bring in significant revenue from complex cardiac cases. They took it seriously. Callum, that's... She didn't have the right word immediately. You couldn't have warned me? I was afraid you'd tell me not to. I would have, I know. She stood on the plaza, not walking, her phone against her ear, watching a pigeon navigate the steps with tremendous dignity. They agreed, he said. Full credentials, salary commensurate with a senior interpreter at a teaching hospital. Health benefits, you keep your schedule flexibility for Theo. A beat. Raymond Pratt also, somewhat grudgingly, apologized for the previous meeting. Vivienne let out a breath that was almost a laugh. He didn't. He did. It was brief and appeared to cause him physical discomfort, but it happened. She did laugh then, a short, real one. And then, because she was tired and relieved, and in a city that wasn't hers and very glad to hear his voice, she said, "Thank you. I know you don't like owing people things. I don't." "Then don't think of it as owing," he said. "Think of it as someone doing what should have been done." She didn't answer right away. A gust came off the Ottawa River and moved through the plaza, and she turned her face away from it. "I have to get the train," she said at last. "No, Vivienne. Yes, when you're back. I'd like to take you and Theo to dinner. Not a professional thank you. Not a formal occasion. Just dinner." A pause. The pigeon had made it to the bottom step and looked satisfied. "Theo will ask you approximately 47 questions," she said. "I've been asked 47 questions before. I'm a surgeon, not like his questions. I'll take my chances." She pulled her coat tighter. The low white sky was the same in every direction. "All right," she said. "Dinner." The following Thursday, GHA's board issued a formal statement acknowledging systemic failures in its clinical oversight, the dissolution of its pharmaceutical partnerships, and the establishment of an independent investigative body to review every trial conducted between 2017 and 2021. The statement included, in the second-to-last paragraph, a line that Vivienne read sitting at her kitchen table with her morning coffee, and read again, and then a third time. Global Health Alliance extends its formal apology to Ms. Vivienne Audette for the harm caused by the organization's response to her reporting in 2020. Ms. Audette demonstrated the professional and ethical integrity that GHA failed to uphold, and we recognize that our actions caused significant and lasting damage to her career and personal life. Theo was eating cereal at the table beside her. He looked up because she had stopped moving. "Mayman, it's okay," she said. "It's good, actually." She folded the newspaper. She had printed the statement, old habit, and set it on the counter and went to the window. Outside, the street was doing its ordinary morning things. A man walked a dog. Someone's car wouldn't start. The maples were losing their leaves in that unhurried autumn way. She had spent 4 years being certain that the truth existed somewhere, and that it would eventually matter. There had been many days when she hadn't quite believed it. She had kept going anyway, because Theo needed his therapy, and the rent needed to be paid, and because she had learned, somewhere along the way, that you don't always get to see the purpose of the thing while you're in the middle of it. Her phone buzzed. A message from Callum. Saw the statement. "How are you?" She thought about it. Then she typed back, "Good, actually good." A moment. Then, "Dinner is still on, right?" She smiled at her phone. Theo looked up from his cereal. "Who's that?" "Callum," he considered. "The doctor who gave me the old gum. That's the one." Theo went back to his cereal. "He can come to dinner," he said, with the authority of a person who has given the matter sufficient deliberation. Dinner was at a small Portuguese place on Monkland that Vivienne had been going to for 3 years. The owner knew her name and brought Theo a ginger ale without being asked. Callum arrived exactly on time in a jacket but no tie, which Vivienne noticed, and which seemed, somehow, like a deliberate decision. Theo asked him 39 questions over the course of the meal. He asked what was the biggest heart Callum had ever worked on, and whether surgeons had to practice on fake hearts first, and why doctors wore masks if viruses were so small they could go through fabric anyway, and whether Callum had ever dropped anything important during an operation. That last question made Vivienne press her napkin to her mouth. Callum answered every question. Not patiently, exactly. That would have suggested it required effort. He answered them with genuine interest, following Theo's logic, taking the questions seriously. Theo, who had a precise internal instrument for detecting when adults were performing attention versus actually paying it, visibly relaxed somewhere around question 12. On the walk home, Callum had insisted on walking them back. Theo held his mother's hand and talked about the Portuguese tarts and whether tarts were technically pies, which occupied him entirely until they reached the building. At the door, Theo said goodnight to Callum with the formality of someone who had made a decision. He went upstairs. Vivienne and Callum stood on the step. "He's extraordinary," Callum said. "Yes," she said. "She meant it the way you mean things when there's no complication in it." Vivienne. He said her name the way he had learned to say it, with weight. "I know you said you don't let people in easily. I did say that. And I'm not asking you to change that, then what are you asking? He looked at her directly in the way he had, that precision but warm now, the way it had been warming gradually for months without her quite noticing the accumulation of it. I'm asking if I can keep showing up, he said. Not with a plan, not with a gesture, just showing up. And you can decide, as things go, what to do with that. She looked at him for a long moment. The maple on the sidewalk moved slightly. A streetlight came on, and the street got warmer and quieter all at once. You already owe $45,000, she said. I do, he agreed. Don't think I've forgotten. I wouldn't dream of it. A pause. And then Vivienne Audette, who had spent 4 years building walls with the same efficient care she applied to everything, said, You can keep showing up. She went inside. He stood on the step in the cool October air, and he felt something that took him a moment to identify, because it had been long enough that he'd almost forgotten what it felt like. He felt, quite simply, like he was in exactly the right place. 6 months later, on a Saturday morning in April, Westmount General Hospital announced the establishment of the Multilingual Patient Advocacy Program, a first-of-its-kind initiative in Quebec that placed trained medical interpreters as embedded members of clinical care teams rather than on-call contractors. The program's director was Vivienne Audette, MSc, whose title on the hospital letterhead appeared, for the first time, alongside the full weight of her credentials. Theo, who had been given a laminated visitor badge by the communications department so he could attend the announcement, wore it for the rest of the day even after they went home, including at dinner, and including, Vivienne noticed, with a feeling she had no precise word for, while he sat across from Callum, explaining at considerable length why the Portuguese place was technically better than the Thai place, even though both were good, and Callum, who was not by nature a person who smiled broadly, was doing it anyway. The city outside was doing its ordinary things. The maples were coming back. Someone's car had finally been fixed. Life, which had been very hard for a long time, was also, quietly, daily, in the particular and unspectacular way that is the only real way it ever happens, becoming something else.